Hi, in this video I have a Bennet Read Force 8 vacuum cleaner, and it is making quite a terrible sound and there's a burning smell. It sounds like a bearing has seized. Right, there are a couple of screws at the bottom. I'm just going to remove them. Right, so I want to get in the motor section, so I'm going to remove that screw, there's one there, there's probably one on this side. Okay, so here's the motor. If you look in here, you can see there's like some fabric in here. There's definitely something in here. There seems to be like carpeting and stuff that's gotten inside there. Okay, I'm just going to remove these connectors which are in the way. So the red one is here. In order to remove it, I just have to depress before I remove it. There's a little pin. So I've removed that one, and there's one here. Just to help it along, I'm just giving a little bit of a lubricant here so that it comes out a bit easier. If you don't have tools like this, you can take a screwdriver, if you've got a strong screwdriver, and just try and tap this off. So all I'm doing is I'm tapping it, rotating, tapping, rotating. Okay, now it's loosened all around. Now I'm just going to carry on tapping until it pops off. It's open now. Alright, so some things have definitely got caught in here. And when I spin this, I can hear that the bearing is finished. Alright, I'm going to undo this nut. This is a size 12. But in order to undo this nut, I'm going to have to block this from turning. So I'm just putting a screwdriver in there, and now I'm going to loosen this nut. I'm going to remove this top piece, and I'm going to remove this plate. And this bearing is completely seized. Notice how the balls of the bearing have actually just popped out. Yeah, that bearing is stuffed. So that's the problem. The bearing on the rotor is destroyed. Right, so if you want to repair this, you can just go and buy one of these bearings, insert it here, and then you can carry on using your vacuum cleaner until the other bearing fails. Or you could change both at the same time if you wanted to. You just have to remove the rotor by tapping it out here, and then you can tap out this bearing. They're probably the same bearing. It's probably worth changing both at the same time. Now, if in your case it's this bearing, all I do is I put a little bit of lubricant just to loosen around the bearing, some penetrating oil. And now what I want to do is I'm just going to tap it. If you're going to replace the bearing, you can tap on the shaft of the rotor. But if you're not going to replace the bearing, it's best not to tap on the shaft, because it puts unnecessary pressure on the balls inside the bearing. Alright, so I've just put it between two bricks. Notice the rotor shaft over here is just going between the bricks so that it doesn't get squashed. So I just do it like that, and now I'm going to tap on that until the bearing comes out. Right, over here is the bearing. Now this is the bearing on the top of the rotor, which has completely come apart. There's the remaining part. There's where the roller is. The little balls roll on there, and this would go like that. Completely destroyed itself. Anyway, I can't pick up a part number from here, so what you could do is you could measure the bearing, and from there you could probably work it out, or ask your local bearing supplier what they have. Now this is how you measure the bearing. I just go like that. The outer diameter is 22, then the inner diameter, I can just take the shaft and measure it like that, and there we go, it's 8. So I've noted the inner diameter is 8, and then you need the thickness. So over here I just take the bearing and I measure the thickness. So it's 6.9, so it's 6.9 millimeters. Possibly it's probably a 7 millimeter, because this is actually a common bearing. I've actually used it quite a lot in the past. Now on the bottom bearing, it's got the part number there, and it even says it, 608Z, and it's made by WTOO, that's the manufacturer. In this case, the top bearing and the bottom bearing are the same, because I've measured the top bearing, but it's not always like that. Sometimes the bottom bearing and the top bearing are different. So all I need to do now is go and locate two of these bearings. I'll have to remove this one, and then I'll have to remove this little roller here, and then I'll reinstall them. Now, how do I know that this bearing over here is actually faulty? So the first thing is it's extremely loose. Then it's got a bit of wobble. As you can see there, it wobbles a bit, so it's a bit worn. The next thing is I can hear the metal sound. It's loose, which is not necessarily broken, but I can hear a little bit of a whir. So when you can hear a bit of a whir, it's like zzz, zzz, zzz. Even though it's not very loud, that's telling me that this bearing is on its way out. Also, if you're going to change the top, you might as well just change the bottom. Now, just inspecting this, look at this. Can you see how that is engraved there? Look at that. The rotor is not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be flat like this with these grooves. But over there, look at that. Totally gouged. And what has happened is here on the stator, the stationary part of the winding, it's been scratched and scraped here. And that's what that grinding sound was. Because what had happened is this part of the bearing was totally worn out. So the rotor was actually wobbling while it was turning. And because of that, it was having that burning smell and that noise. So I'm now going to go and get 2 bearings, and then I'll demonstrate how to reinstall this and get this vacuum cleaner into its second life. Right, so there's the bearing 608Z. I've got the 2 replacements. Here's the brand new bearing. It's a steel bearing. See, the side here is steel. And it's also a sealed bearing. Now the job is to get these bearings on the rotor. Right, here's the rotor and what is left of this bearing. So I need to get this one off over here. Now it is quite difficult because there isn't much to grab here. Now I do not want to damage the shaft or the threads here. So if you're going to tap this off, I advise you to put the nut back on so that you don't damage the threads by hitting it on the ground. So I'll put the nut back on, leaving a little bit of a gap there so I don't damage the threads. Now I could try and take a tool and tap it out. Alternatively, if you have a vice grip, this is a vice grip, what I will do is I'm going to grab it on there and tap this. So I'll quickly demonstrate. So I position it until it's fairly tight. And just before I do this, I'm just going to put some more lubrication here just to help it over here as well. Don't worry if it gets on the commutator over here, we'll sort that out later. Right, that penetrating lubricant will just help it along as it climbs out of here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it here with my vice grip. Right, so I've made it quite tight, not extremely tight. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can turn this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a hammer and tap around the vice grip. So I'm tapping on the front, then the back. And over there, one can see that it has started to move. There's a little gap that has formed there. So it is working. Unfortunately on mine, there was some damage here from when the bearing was broken. So mine is extra stiff. In my case, I might even have to cut this part of the old bearing out. So in my case, if you look closely, you might see it's quite rough here, and that's probably from some damage that took place when this bearing had failed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently file some of this down here just to smooth this out because my shaft's a bit damaged. So on yours, you wouldn't need to do this step. I'm just filing it a little bit on the edge there. And after filing it, I take a 600 grit sandpaper and just smooth it out. Okay, so some of that damage is now smoothed out. Now what I'll do is I'll try again. I'm going to put a little bit of penetrating lubrication here, and now I'll try and tap it off. Right, so I've got the nut on there so that I don't damage the shaft, the threads on the shaft, and then I can hit it onto a hard surface. That shock from the hard surface is very helpful. Now, if you're having a lot of difficulty getting this off, you could use a Dremel or even a grinder, but very carefully open the one side here and then this will release. Mine is coming off, but I'm just going to demonstrate a different method. Here I have a Dremel and I'm just cutting through the one side of what's left over of this bearing. Right, so I've now removed this, and now I just need to remove this side. Because I'm going to be replacing this bearing, it doesn't matter if the bearing gets damaged when I remove it. Right, usually there's a bit of a space to get this bearing off, but I don't want to damage the copper commutator by pushing things in here to wedge the bearing off. So I'm just going to cut this bearing out. So I've got a Dremel here, and I'm just going to cut it out. Right, so there's the bearing. I've cut it and I'm just lifting it out now. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grip this with my vice grip and tap it off like I did the other one. Just putting a bit of penetrating lubricant there. Right, so it is actually turning. So all I'm going to do is now tap it off. Right, there you can see it's coming off. Just a few more taps. Right, so that's off now. Now all I need to do is install the new bearings. Right, it doesn't matter which way it goes on. I'm just checking that this is still smooth. It is. And it's very important that when you tap on the new bearing, you do not tap on the outside, but you tap on the inside. So what I do is I take a socket and I put it over there and I'm going to tap on the socket, which is going to engage on the inner track, and that will slide it on. I can't hit over here, it'll break the bearings. Just make sure that it is seated correctly. As you can see, mine is seated skew. This will not work. If your shaft is a little bit rough, take an 800 grit or higher sandpaper and just smooth it out a little bit. Right, so here's the unit. Here are the two replacement bearings. Now I just need to put the two bearings on, one over there and one on this side. You can put some penetrating oil just here just to help it. And there it is moving towards the bottom seat. In terms of the top one, I can hit it until I hear a change in the sound. Then I know it has hit this bottom seat. Right, so the sound has suddenly changed. It's become higher pitched, and there I can see it's hit the seat. So the top bearing is now in place. Now the bottom bearing, I need to seat it, but not too much because I don't want it to be too close to this plastic washer. I want to leave about a mil or mil and a half gap. So I just keep checking. It's almost there. Remember that before there was only a tiny bit coming out here. So it just requires 1 or 2 taps. Right, so it is now seated correctly. If your rotor windings are damaged, for example, I had a snap over here, then I just extended the wire, melted the enamel, soldered it to where the other coil ran. And over here I had one as well. Probably from hitting with a hammer over here, probably bumped it, and then I just put it in some resin. Right, now it's time to reinstall this. I'm just going to clean up this commutator. You can see that it's got some imperfections. I'm just lightly sanding it, lightly. This is an 800 grit, and all I'm doing is really polishing. I'm just polishing the top layer. As you can see, it's got a lot of grooves in here. I'm just polishing it. Right, so there it's now polished and I can insert this, but there are 2 brushes that seat like this. So I've got to pull the brushes apart in order to get this inside. Right, so there are the 2 brushes. Be very careful, they are brittle. They are spring loaded, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull them back and then hold them in place. Or if it's easier, you can actually remove the brushes, insert the rotor and then put them back. Here is where I can remove the brushes if I wanted to. Now because there's holes here, I'm going to just spread the brushes and hold them open with my fingers because I've got access here. If your vacuum cleaner does not have access here, if the motor hasn't got access, you might have to open this and then pull the brush back. On some vacuum cleaners, there's a little clip here. You can open the clip and the brush will pop out. Then you can insert the rotor and then push the brush back in. Right, so the order is this goes first, which sits like that, offers a bit of a suspension for the rotor, and then the rotor goes inside. So I'm now opening these brushes, holding it open with my fingers. There you can see my finger is holding it open. I'm going to insert this washer, the spring washer. Right, the spring washer is right at the bottom there. Now I can insert the rotor. Right, and you might be able to see the brush, but it's sitting on the bearing, and there is the commutator, those copper strips. So all I need to do is pull the brushes back a little bit and then seat the rotor inside. I do not want to damage those brushes, so I have to be very careful now. So what I'm doing is I'm going on the one side and I'm lifting the brush, I'm lifting it over, and then I go to the other side and I do the same thing. And once I lifted the brush, there you can see the brush is now sitting on the commutator, but I just need to now seat that bearing into this bulge over here. So because the brushes are now on the commutator, I can now tap on this side. I won't damage anything. Right, now spin it a few times, no noise, Now I can just reassemble everything. Right, so I can put this plate back. Then there's this bushing that goes over there. Now I can return these screws. Right, now I return this. Right, now I return this washer. The smooth side faces up. The side with these little bumps faces down. Then the smooth side of this washer faces down, and then I've got the nut. Now tightening this nut might be tricky because as you can see the whole unit is moving, and even if I wedge here it is still not tightening the nut because it is moving over there. Being very careful not to damage anything, I need to wedge my tool in here and put pressure on the rotor so that it can't turn.
I only wedge my screwdriver where the arrow is pointing between the cores.
Right, and then final tightening, I put my screwdriver here, and now I can tighten this until those washers move. That is kind of a slip function, is intentionally like that. Because this isn't a lock nut, I just put a tiny bit of cold glue. Right, spin it a bit. The only sound I'm hearing are the brushes on the commutator. Using a very balanced force, I seat the cover. That would be incorrect. As you can see, it's coming at an angle. If this is too difficult, another way of doing it is putting it like that and then watching where it's not engaging. Right, if you're having trouble getting this on, it's quite tricky. So what I do is I'm going to locate a part that I'm going to work with, which is going to be here. I'm just going to mark it from there to there. So this represents the part that is getting stuck. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to tap it with a hammer at an angle so it bends in a little bit. Right, so you might be able to see it's not as out as it was, it's going in a little bit. So looking from the top view, it's actually beveled in a bit. So now I can first put the other side in, and now, as you can see, where I hammered it, it's folding inwards. And so I just got to hammer a little bit here. There we go, it's already climbing over. Right, so now I tap it with an even force all round. Right, so it is now seated. If you do have a blower, it's a good idea to blow it out before you reassemble. Right, so here's the motor. I just need to plug in the connectors, the wires. Now on this vacuum, you can see there's this rubber bushing that goes here. It seems like this goes first, and then this goes over it like that. And I can seat this in here. There's a gap here. This is where the wires feed in. So this white wire is going at the back. Right, so this red wire I can also seat in that little gap there. I'm going to pull these wires a bit to the side, out of the way, and I can put the cover on. This is the cover. Right, this has to go over these raised sections there, so it means I'm going to have to kind of go over it like that. Otherwise, if I can't do this, what I'll do is I will put the motor in this and then seat this thing. Okay, so in this case, it's easier to seat the motor in this capsule first and then put it into the main body. Right, so it's imperative that it's flush all the way around because that's the vacuum seal. Right, now I'm just installing the power switch. Right, so I've just installed the power switch. There's a gap for the wire. Put the filters back in. Right, now I'm just putting the top cover back on. Make sure everything is flush. While you're tightening the screws, check that the seams are engaging and that they are closing. For example, here it is not closed. Right, as you can see, the seam is closing. Right, so all it needs is to be wiped, but I'll just demonstrate that it is now working. Right, so I can power it on. Right, thanks for watching and cheers.